Somebody else just turned up. We're nothing if not punctual here, are we? That's good. Yeah, we'll run the message and then it should be fine.
Welcome to TheoCafe. Before we begin, we'd like to set a few ground rules and guidelines to make things run as smoothly as possible. Number 1. Disagreement does not mean disrespect. Diversity is a good thing, which means we will have different opinions to share. Number 2. Deconstruct ideas, not the person. If you don't agree with someone, by all means challenge a statement, but only in a constructive manner. Another way to say this is play the ball, not the player. Number 3. Be willing to have your ideas challenged and be ready to back yourself with evidence. Just my opinion is not the end of the conversation. Number 4. For the benefit of everyone, please wait for a microphone to be brought to you before you share your questions or comments. Some of us may not hear you, especially our online viewers who will not hear you at all without a microphone. Now that we've established our rules and guidelines, please enjoy TheoCafe.
Lovely. That short service announcement cost us about $10,000 to produce. I'm kidding, of course. It didn't cost us anything. Thank you to the anonymous donor of it. Wonderful. It reminds me of when you're about to get on like a ride at Dreamworld or something. You know, please keep your hands and feet inside the coaster at all times. All right. So welcome everybody to TheoCafe this month. This is a really fun topic, and we're kind of dipping our toes into it at the 6 p.m. service, where we have a thing called Circle Time, where after our very short 30-minute worship, we sit around in a circle and chat, support each other, discuss theological things. And so we've been touching on this little topic during that once or twice. So the name of the TheoCafe is on the next slide. The Other Bible. So there's a story about this, well, a little bit. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library is quite interesting. So in 1945, I believe it was, yep, that's right, there were two brothers who were going looking for manure in Egypt, believe it or not. So they were going to look for some manure, and they started digging, and they found something close by, hit into it. And so they thought, oh, this is probably good manure. And they pulled up this massive jar, and inside that jar was a whole bunch of different codices that were bound in leather. You know what a codex is? It's like a very early form of a book, basically. And long story short, they found over 50 different texts from very early Christianity, or very early in the tradition, and also some rewritten texts or different versions of text. In fact, there was a version of Plato's Republic in there as well, which is really quite strange. And some stuff in Isaiah that we didn't know existed, a few different verses that we didn't know were there. But the interesting stuff was there were infancy gospels. Right? Well, there's lots of interesting stuff, but this is the interesting one for me. So the period between when Jesus was born to when he was about 12 years old, arguing with the guys in the temple, which we miss. So they are really fun. We will touch on them today because they are hilarious. Infancy Gospels, there was a whole bunch of different Gospels known as Gnostic Gospels. Gnostic basically means knowledge, really. And there's no real kind of one sect of Gnostics. They were different, but very much about a hidden knowledge. So there's books where John is taught a hidden knowledge from Jesus that nobody else knows and all this kind of jazz. All right, so we can go to the next slide. That was a really quick rundown. Nag Hammadi Library. That's what we're talking about today. Next one. Discovered 1945 in Upper Egypt. Just keep going through them, basically. 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 different texts. Yes, look, if there are grammatical errors, which there will be probably, as long as you can understand what it says, that's what matters. Found by a local farmer, Muhammad al-Saman, and his brother. His brother doesn't get any credit. Also, there was a blood feud involved, which is interesting. And this is really grisly. They ended up actually finding the guy who had killed their father, and they killed him and took his limbs off. Yeah, there we go. We're all adults here. There's no kids that are going to lose sleep from that. But it's really juicy kind of history behind the Nag Hammadi Library. All right, next one, please. Yeah, it is very handy. It's good pub knowledge. 52 most early Gnostic treatises. I didn't get a chance to check this. Great. So make fun of me. I'm the one who wrote it. Next one. A partial translation and alteration of Plato's Republic. Isn't that funny that was in there? Yeah, really cool. Next one. Possibly belonged to the Pachomian monastery. It was fairly nearby. And there was a whole bunch of Gnostics at that monastery. Not like the good brothers of St. Francis today, the friars that we have them. These were naughty Gnostics at the Pachomian monastery. Next one. Buried after St. Athanasius after his condemnation of non-canonical books. So the theory is that these were probably buried once St. Athanasius started really bringing in the condemnation of non-canonical books, and actually people started burning them frequently. So these people that found these texts really important to them ran off away from their monastery and buried them. So they'll be dug up by two manure farmers in 1,000 years' time. Interesting. Some people would claim what they found was manure, but I don't think so. I think there's some gold in there. All right, next one. Written in Coptic. You know what Coptic is? Like an Egyptian language. So we have Coptic Orthodox Church that speak in Coptic, pray in Coptic. So they're written in Coptic, but they very much, almost definitely, were translations from an earlier time. It would have been written in Greek, and they think some of it in Aramaic and all that sort of jazz. Next one. Many burned by his mother to fuel the stove before they knew what they were. So, isn't that hilarious? God has a sense of humour. All right, so what happened is he took these things back to his mum after they had dealt with their blood feud, and they didn't really know what they had. So mum just kind of put it next to the stove, and instead of bothering going and getting wood and other combustibles, she just started filing Nag Hammadi library texts into the fire to cook things. Imagine what was lost. What could have been lost? They probably had a copy of a gospel with Q printed on the front that was, burned in that fire. Wouldn't that be amazing if that was the case? But apparently the majority of what they found was burned for fuel on that fire. Oh, amazing. Very good. And you're really lucky today because Brother Nathan's here, so anything I say that's inaccurate during the comments, he can correct me. Good. Next one. Okay, so they date from the late 1st century. This is what the consensus among most scholars is. You never get full consensus about this stuff. But they date from the late 1st century up until around the 4th century. So that's really early, actually, some of them. Especially things like the Gospel of Thomas. A lot of scholars will argue that that's really quite early, potentially written around the same time as the Synoptics. And one of the Nativity Gospels I'm going to read for you today was probably written not long after, if not around the same time as the Gospel of John. So these are early texts, some of them. All right, next one. All right, the Gospel of Thomas. This is probably the most famous of the Gnostic Gospels, in that I think probably fairly accurate to say this is the one that most people outside of the church or people who have heard it in the church have probably heard of, the Gospel of Thomas. Right? And it's been part of conspiracy theories being fueled around it and stuff as well for quite a long time. And it's an interesting text. So I think next what we have is a new segment that I made especially for today's TheoCafe. Oh, no, not yet. Not really Gnostic. Why? So many scholars argue that actually the Gospel of Thomas isn't really that Gnostic, because it doesn't have anywhere near the strong themes that the other Gnostic texts do. That it doesn't have this grand, incredible creation story, this secret creation story involved in it that just about all the other Gnostic texts have, or at least refer to. So it's not really fair to call it a Gnostic gospel proper. It's kind of Gnostic light, a little bit like John almost could be said has little hints of Gnosticism in it. In fact, the prologue to John, some could argue, holds a bit more of a Gnostic theme than Thomas does, because it has no creation narrative. All right, next one. Yeah, it has no narrative whatsoever, the Gospel of Thomas. So we're only focusing on 2 because I don't have time to do any more. But if there's any questions about others, we'll talk about them. I want to keep this brief from me so we can chat. All right, so there's no narrative in Thomas. It's all basically just sayings. Some of those sayings actually agree with some of the stuff out of the Synoptics and are exact copies, or very, very close to exact copies of stuff out of the Synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Right? And some of the narratives some of the sayings in Thomas are unique to Thomas. Unique in the sense that we don't have any other Gospels at the moment that have those sayings in them. There could be others out there, who knows? They could have been burned in that stove, right? Quite seriously. All right, next one. So Thomas has traditional parables, prophecies, proverbs, and sayings of Jesus. If you picked up part of Thomas today or had some Thomas read to you on a Sunday, a lot of the time, apart from the more fringy stuff, which there's not that much of, but if I read one of these things out of Thomas and didn't tell you it was out of Thomas on a Sunday, you probably would just think, oh yeah, it's just from one of the Gospels. Right? All right, next slide. Dated to the later part of the 1st century, which makes this Gospel a bit younger, but around a similar time as the latest of our Synoptic Gospels. And there are scholars that absolutely vehemently argue for an earlier time than that. But you can't say there's a consensus. So this is an old gospel. All right, next slide. Contains many sayings which are found in the canonical, I've already said that, as well as vastly different material. Next one. All right, is this our new segment? Story time with old Uncle Clay. Excellent. This is the segment. This is the whole reason I have this chair up here, right? So story time. Right. Sit down and let old Uncle Clay read you a story. Right. So now I've got to find it in here. I'm just going to read you a little bit out of Thomas to give you an idea of something similar to the Gospels which are in Thomas and something which is quite different. Here we go. 299, 299, 299. This is where I need to fade up the turntable. All right. It is 299, isn't it? Lovely. All right. No idea yet. Haven't decided. I'm deciding now. So there's a few different things here. The disciples said, so this is in this book here, the other Bible, which is where I stole our title from. Being a musician and also being, I'm not claiming to be a theologian, but being a musician or a theologian gives you license to steal, right? It's very important to know that. So this is from the Gospel of Thomas, no idea what chapter. It just says, verse 18 here. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us how our end will be." Jesus said, "You have discovered then the beginning, that you look for the end. For where the beginning is, there will the end be. Blessed is he who will take his place in the beginning. He will know the end and will not experience death." The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what the kingdom of heaven is like." He said to them, oh, this sounds a bit familiar actually. He said to them, "It is like a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, but when it falls on tilled soil, it produces a great plant and becomes a shelter for birds of the sky." Sound familiar? If I read that to you on Sunday, you'd probably think, oh yeah, that's probably from one of the synoptics. And I wouldn't blame you. Right? So Mary said to Jesus, "Whom are your disciples like?" Jesus said, "They are like children who have settled in a field which is not theirs. When the owners of the field come, they will say, 'Let us have back our field.' They will undress in their presence in order to let them have back their field and give it back to them. Therefore I say to you, if the owner of the house knows that the thief is coming, he will begin his vigil before he comes and will not let him dig through into his house of his domain to carry away his goods. You then be on guard against the world. Arm yourselves with great strength, lest the robbers find a way to come to you, for the difficulty which you expect will surely materialize." Familiar as well, right? There's just a slight difference. That's the parable of the robber coming into the house. Very interesting stuff. And then there's much different things. So makes peace with each other in this house. They will say to the mountain, "Move away," and it will move away, right? You will do greater things than me. In fact, you say to this mountain, "Go there," and there, it will go there and there. So very similar stuff. And he talks about in here that there will be, and this is something that a lot of culturally conservative, because this issue is nowhere near as much of a theological issue as culturally we like to make it out to be. But culturally very conservative people would have a major issue with Thomas, because he says there is no male and female, and eventually there will be no disparity or distinction between gender. He's a liberal communist, right? That kind of thing. So, yeah, Gospel of Thomas. Very similar stuff, and stuff that's actually quite different to our Gospels, and that's where the Gnostic understanding comes in. Okie dokie. Next one. This is fun. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Next one. Thomas didn't write either of those things, by the way. Just like the other Gospels, they're attributed to people. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they didn't write them. They're attributions to them. Thomas is the same. Certainly didn't write the Gospel of Thomas. Definitely didn't write the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Written in 150 CE or AD, whatever you want to use. Common Era, CE means. Next one. Extremely popular among early Christians. What I'm going to read from you from soon was extremely popular among early Christians. And I love that it was that. All right, next one. Deals with the period between the birth and the incident at the temple at 12. I think this is story time with old Uncle Clay again. There we go. Excellent. Okay. All right, let me tell you a story about little boy Jesus. Think of the Hallmark cards, and you'll be sorely disappointed. Where are we? Infancy Gospel. Okay, 398. This is great. This is so much fun. 398. If you can turn in your other Bibles to page 398, that would be lovely. Thank you. All right, I'll read a little bit out of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. I, Thomas the Israelite, liar, Thomas didn't write this. I, Thomas the Israelite, announce and make known to you, to all you brethren from the Gentiles, the childhood and great deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because it said that, it must have been written by him. That's how we treat other pieces of scripture in our Bible. We shouldn't treat them like that, because we know Thomas didn't write this, which he did when he was born in our country. This is the beginning. When this child Jesus was 5 years old, he was playing at the ford of a stream. He made pools of rushing water and made it immediately pure. He ordered this by word alone. He made soft clay and modeled 12 sparrows from it. It was the Sabbath when he did this. There were many other children playing with him. A certain Jew saw what Jesus did while playing on the Sabbath. He immediately went and announced to his father Joseph, "See, your child is at the stream and has taken clay and molded 12 birds. He has profaned the Sabbath." Joseph came to the place, and seeing what Jesus did, he cried out, "Why do you do on the Sabbath what is not lawful for you to do?" Jesus clapped his hands and cried to the sparrows, "Begone!" And the sparrows flew off chirping. The Jews saw this and were amazed. They went away and described to their leaders what they had seen Jesus do. It gets a bit better. I'll read on a little bit. The son of Annas, the scribe, was standing there with Joseph. He took a branch of a willow and scattered the water, which Jesus had arranged. Jesus saw what he did and became angry and said to him, this is great, "You unrighteous, impious ignoramus, what did the pools and the water do to harm you? Behold, you shall also wither as a tree, and you shall not bear leaves nor roots or fruit." And immediately the child was all withered. Naughty boy Jesus. He withered a child because he was upset. Jesus left and went to the house of Joseph. The parents of the withered one bore him away, bemoaning his lost youth. They led him to Joseph and proclaimed and reproached him. "What kind of child have you which does such things?" Once again, he was going through the village, and a child who was running banged into his shoulder. Jesus was angered and said to him, "You shall go no further on your way." And immediately the child fell down dead. Some people saw this happen and said, "From whence was this child begotten? For his every word is an act accomplished." The parents of the dead boy went to Joseph and blamed him. "Because you have such a boy, you cannot live with us in the village. Your alternative is to teach him to bless and not curse, for he is killing our children." Joseph took the child aside privately and warned him, saying, "Why do you do such things? These people are suffering and they hate us and are persecuting us." Jesus said, "I know that these are not your words, but on account of you I will be silent." You can see how he's like a bratty kid. "But on account of you I'll be silent. However, they shall bear their punishment." Immediately those who cursed him were blinded. Those who saw were very frightened and puzzled, and they said about him, "Every word he speaks, whether good or evil, happens and is a miracle." Basically, he raises the boy from the dead again. Yeah. So he raises the boy from the dead again out of spite, and then goes off and learns from a learned teacher, and he's all of a sudden not killing kids and withering them. He uses his power for good. Infancy gospel of Thomas. Think, if that had been accepted into the canon, just because it was accepted into the canon, I can almost guarantee there would be people standing up here on a Sunday justifying Jesus killing children, because they love the Bible more than they love the proclamation of God and Christ and how he lived and followed it. Right? So this is funny, it's hilarious, and it's really interesting, and there are a bunch of early Christian communities that loved and followed this as part of their scripture, right? So that's important for us to know. However, it really does teach us something about how we approach scripture and where we need to be very careful. All right, next slide. Oh, the Acts of John. I was going to read out of that too. Okay, I haven't got much time. Yeah. Acts of John, next one. 2nd to 3rd century. This one's a bit later. I don't need to use that. Heretical, consigned to the fire at the Nicene Council. The Council of Nicaea, the ones that chose the canon, basically didn't like this. They consigned it to the fire. It's also the council where Saint Nick, Santa, good old Saint Nick, punched Arius in the face. All right, next one. Tells of the deeds of John the Apostle. Next one. Also among this collection are the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Peter, and the Acts of Thomas. So now we have the book of Acts, written by the same author as Luke, right? But this extends that. It tells of the acts of all these people as well. Next one. Okay, last story time with old Uncle Clay. Can you give me 2 minutes? Is that all right? All right. And then there's a lot more in here, but I'm just cutting it down. So what was I reading again? The Acts of John, 4:13. Acts 4:13. Acts of John. What did I want to read out of this? John. Well, this is. All right. So I'm reading from a piece of the Acts of John under a heading, Christ's Earthly Appearance. This is what makes it really quite heretical in certain ways. "For when he had chosen Peter and Andrew, who were brothers, he came to me and to my brother James, saying, 'I need you, come with me.' And my brother said to me, John, what does he want? This child on the shore who called us. And I said, which child? And he answered me, the one who is beckoning us. And I said, this is because of the long watch we have kept at sea. You are not seeing straight, Brother James. Do you not see the man standing there who is handsome, fair, and cheerful looking? But he said to me, I do not see that man, my brother. But let us go, and we will see what this means. And when we had brought the boat to the land, we saw how he also helped us to beach the boat. And as we left the place, wishing to follow him, he appeared to me again as rather bald-headed, but with a thick, flowing beard. So we have really handsome Jesus, and now we have bald Jesus, flowy beard Jesus. And to James as a young man, whose beard was just beginning. We have another type of Jesus. So we wondered, both of us, about the meaning of the vision we had seen. Then, as we both followed him, we became gradually more perplexed about this matter. But then there appeared to me yet a more amazing sight. I tried to see him as he was, and I never saw his eyes closing, but always open. But he sometimes appeared to me as a small man with no good looks, and then again as looking up to heaven. And he had other strange property. When I reclined at table, he would take me to his own breast, and I held him fast. And sometimes his breasts felt smooth and soft, but sometimes hard like a rock. So that I was perplexed in my mind and said, why do I find it so? And it keeps going through this way. He has these visions of Jesus, sometimes bald and ugly, sometimes really nice looking, sometimes with a big flowy beard, sometimes with barely any beard. But it goes on to say that Jesus on the cross was not really in his human form, didn't really feel the pain, but was there in like a spiritual form, and he didn't feel any pain with it. So that's heretical. That's a heresy. Right? That's why it's not there. So, very, very interesting. Don't say you've never been taught about the Nag Hammadi library, the Gnostic Gospels and things in church, because you have. Tell people about them. Get them to read them. Give them context around it. It's a really interesting part of our Christian heritage. The Gospel of Thomas has some really good stuff amongst it. And there were strong arguments against certain things that ended up in the canon that nearly didn't. Right? Things like Revelation nearly didn't make it into the canon. Interesting. So that's just scratching the surface, because I don't want to talk forever and I want to get us talking. So, this one's a bit more difficult to start a conversation because we're not debating anything, really. We're not really arguing, which is disappointing. Any questions, concerns, ideas, corrections, anything you would like to debate on this topic? Anything that comes to mind immediately about the other Bible? This will be a short TheoCafe. Yep, excellent. Adam, good. Our Catholic brother in the back. Wonderful.
What was it?
I said our Catholic brother in the back.
Not for long if I keep going at this rate. Just thinking about young Jesus in the story, it reminded me of how a lot of the pagan gods, they put negative, evil traits onto them, and they had the power to let loose these negative traits on the world. So I wonder if there was any intention of the writer to make it a bit more palatable for the pagans to be introduced to a murderous Jesus.
You haven't read the commentary? You haven't read the commentaries on them? On the Nag Hammadi library?
I've read the Apocrypha.
Yep. Oh, the Apocrypha. Yeah, that's actually part of the canon, really.
I've read that before, and I've read stuff about the Gnostics, so I can't remember reading
Yeah.
anything about that.
Because you've hit the nail on the head with some of it. Yeah, really good. Yeah. So scholars think that because there was Buddhist influence around the area of Alexandria at the time as well, and also some of the Zoroastrian stuff, and some other stuff coming over from India, like Hinduism, all melding together. So they do think some of that actually influenced some of the stories in the Gnostic Gospels to make it more palatable, and some of them actually followed a bit of that thinking. So yeah, really good. Good pickup. Eli, one of the good Elis.
We haven't heard about his childhood, though.
Now, you've made me lose my thought. Oh, is it possible that in that time, like you were saying, in our time there are a lot of people who actually make the Bible the holy Word of God, like in a real...
They kind of make it
Idolise it.
into God, yeah.
And they've got to make it seem better than it is. But back then, they wouldn't have had that aspect about it because it was the New Testament things weren't written, so to speak. We're talking first, second centuries before anything was put down in writing. And so what I'm saying is back then, there would not have been this, well, I know I grew up, you don't mark your Bible.
Sure.
That's terrible.
Yeah, God gets upset.
Oh, that's the Bible.
Makes
you know.
Jesus cry. Yeah.
Would that be a case of the way they look at things differently to this modern age?
Possibly, although certainly in the Jewish tradition, actually the text is super important as well. I mean, our Bibles are really important. I mean, they're central to what we do. But I think, would it be fair to, just judging what I saw in Jerusalem and stuff, Brother Nathan, would it be fair to say that certainly in sort of more orthodox expressions of Judaism, they would probably think even more so, they'd take an even further step towards, this. The reason I'm saying this is because they put bits of scripture on their head and tie it up, and on their arms and tie it up. So I think even more so in that tradition, is kind of the Bible revered in that way. So potentially, there may be less, but there would have been certainly sections where it was even more so, I think. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, well, my thought is that with the gospel being so young and not written, so they can't tie these things, have the traditional aspect. But lots of stuff would have been going around, I'm sure, because people would have known Jesus and seen Acts and whatever else. And so word of mouth, these stories get around. And then, by first century it started going, oh, we better write this stuff down.
And thank God for Koine Greek, because that's how it really got around the empire really quick, the language of commerce at the time.
Yeah, and so over time, tradition again makes the scriptures become, or the Bible, or the writings becoming a book, the Bible, that becomes more revered, what's written, and we stick to it. Because I think with so much falsehood that is around, they're trying to clear up what is false and what is true.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're making a good point. It is interesting that there are some of the oldest version, actually I think the oldest version of Isaiah that was found amongst Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there were some extra verses in there. There was very little difference to the translations we have today, which is great. It means like the whole Chinese whispers argument's kind of knocked out of the park. But I think what you're saying is supported by, why have we not added those extra verses into Isaiah? Simply because our Bibles are already made up and that's the way they are. So this could actually be a more accurate, or an earlier at least, understanding of the writings, but we're not going to adjust what we already have, sealed in the canon. Yes, Brother Nathan.
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, and I'm probably going to be probably a little bit generic here, or a little bit generalising, but within both the Judaism and Islamic traditions, their scriptures are more revered than ours are. You wouldn't see within those traditions their scriptures just kind of placed anywhere. They would typically have a specific place for them, and you wouldn't just, within Christian traditions, you tend to find the Bible would just be kind of around places. So there is a sense that they do revere their written words a lot better. The other thing I was kind of thinking is that when we're having this kind of conversation, part of sits in the background to this is how the canon was formed.
Yeah.
So when they were forming the canon at Nicaea and having those discussions, they were looking for a couple of different things. One was that document used by lots of people? Was it a common thing? Did many people read that, and were people finding those as common exchanged documents? The second thing they were looking at was who wrote it? Who was the person who wrote that? Was there any kind of authority? Did that person have a known authority? Which is interesting that you've got Thomas and Paul and some others that kind of, because you would have thought they were kind of authorities. The other one, though, which is interesting in this discussion, is was it consistent with the theology of the time, the predominant theology of the time? And clearly, these are contrary to the popular theology of the time that the church was trying to form. So you've also got to bear in mind here, you've got the church, certainly in that early first century, when they are starting to capture Jesus' stories and write the documents. Christianity is trying to find what it is when it's not Judaism. So you've got to remember the first Christians were Jewish people. They were brought up in the Jewish tradition, they learned the Jewish scriptures and etc., as Jesus did. It wasn't until after kind of the destruction of the temple and the kind of the kicking out of the Jewish people and the movement into the Gentile countries that Christianity started to have to say, well, how are we different to Judaism? What's our story? So they're trying to formulate what they are, and so they're looking for that consistency of things. And you can see that something like Thomas where's the other bits that kind of support it as a thing? So you can see how it kind of doesn't go out. Just the last thing, if you haven't already seen it, there's a movie called The Young Messiah. Has anyone heard it or seen it? Yeah, The Young Messiah. It's Hollywood,
Sure.
but it is interesting in light of this discussion because the Young Messiah portrays kind of the teenage years of Jesus. Around the time where they're kind of starting to move into that, so that year 12, that 12, 13 year where he's starting to kind of engage with the scholars at the temples. And so really, I knew about the clay story and bird story, but they portrayed it a bit differently in that he sees a dead bird on the sea and he picks it up and he heals this bird and it flies away.
Oh, that's nice.
But there is an interesting bit where there's an older boy who kind of taunts Jesus quite a lot, and then suddenly this boy's dead.
Yeah, sure.
And then people hate on Jesus, so he goes back and heals him.
That's a similar thing. They followed the theme.
So they've obviously bought into it, the Gospel of Thomas stories. But it's very fascinating, particularly if we ask, why do we have them? Why do we not have these? And what were the decisions that went into making, because we have created the story that we want.
Yes.
And we continue to create the story that we want. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both very much. And it's interesting that we knew of the Gospel of Thomas and we knew of the infancy gospel I read to you. There's other infancy gospels. But we knew of those before Nag Hammadi was found, because they were written they were written of by some early church fathers. So, I mean, that attests to their at least being a bit popular. Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that, Brother Nathan. I agree. And a lot of, you can see some very clear, now we call them heresies in some of them. So some of them just don't agree with the Trinity, right? And that's, funnily enough, you'll hear it claimed all the time, as long as you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Saviour, then you are a Christian. Well, actually, the central thing that's tied all Christians together since the canon really was, and the Nicene Creed was agreed upon, was actually proclaiming the triune God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's why every church that baptizes in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit will recognize the baptism of the other church that does that, even if they do it differently. But in here, some just think there is God, there is Yahweh, who is actually a bit of an evil God, believe it or not, in some of this, that created the earth. Then there's Jesus, who is different to that God, and all this kind of stuff. Anybody want to run away and start a Gnostic cult?
There's one in Ashgrove if you're interested. They're a little bit different though. Yeah, just thinking about, was it Arianism, which was, they didn't believe that Christ was God incarnate, or some heresy that they believed.
That's the one. Yeah. So I was referring almost to Arianism before. That's Arianism, Patrick. So the idea on the cross, he didn't really feel the pain because he wasn't really fully human.
And that stayed around for like almost until 1000 AD, didn't it? Like some of the tribes that sacked Rome, they believed in those heresies. So it was obviously popular. Like these texts must have been generally sort of popular somewhere.
Yeah, Brother Nathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Arius was actually at the Council of Nicaea. Yeah, because that's who Saint Nick punched in the face.
Yeah, he would have been there too as one of the kind of the bishops.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, obviously when they're choosing the canon, as I said, one of the criteria is consistency with theology.
Yep. And
Arian was, of course, saying that Jesus wasn't the fully human.
Yes.
So he was simply just God that looked like a human, which was counter to the Trinitarian argument that was, part of the discussions.
Fantastic. Did somebody else have a microphone? Oh, Vicky, wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Hello.
There we go. Lovely. Well done.
I have two simple questions.
Yep.
Why is Luke the only gospel that tells us about Jesus' birth? And secondly, the books that were included by the Council of Nicaea, certain books were left out, but the Catholic Church still uses. It's called the Apocrypha. But Emperor Constantine, there's a theory that says Constantine liked the Christians because he thought they could further his political adventures.
100%. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. So the Apocrypha, the intertestamental period kind of books that it's not just the Catholics, Anglicans, we have them in any of our decent Bibles. Orthodox still contain the Apocrypha. A lot of Lutherans still have the Apocrypha. I think they're important books. They're not books that we develop any doctrine on. Right? It's in the 39 Articles, it says that. But they are, they can be good for moral learning or something. I forget the actual wording. Something along that line. It wasn't until the Reformation that anybody left the Apocrypha out. to be honest. So I didn't even know they weren't included in the canon. They were included in the canon. Well, they weren't put out, were they?
Actually, I'd have to check that myself because I'm not sure what was on Athanasius' original list.
Yeah.
But they were certainly part of, as you said, all early traditions.
Yes.
And it wasn't really to the Reformation that they were taken out because they weren't seen as important as the testamental stuff. They were just more, as you said, for nice reading, but they weren't helpful in constructing doctrine and theology.
Great. And I mean, we actually read them during the year in Anglican churches too on a Sunday. They only come up a couple of times, but we do read from the Apocrypha on a Sunday. Yeah. And that's the only place that we know of Archangel Raphael is from Tobit in the Apocrypha. It's very interesting stuff. Adam.
The other question was about the birth of Jesus.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Gospels all have different goals and aims in their messages. I wish I remembered, there was a really kind of pithy saying about some of them in college that I can't remember, but something about Luke basically being a birth narrative with a bit tacked on the end, and there was a passion narrative with a bit tacked on the front. I think it was meant to be Matthew or something. But yeah, so the birth really is only found kind of in Luke, really, in a big way. It is in Matthew, but it's very different. Yeah. Yeah, Mark certainly doesn't have a birth narrative. You could argue John does actually have a Genesis, really. I love the prologue of John. I sometimes call that third Genesis, because it's quite beautiful in many ways. But yeah, so there's two. There's Matthew and there's Luke, the birth of Jesus.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you said, each of the Gospels had a particular...
Yes.
And if we look at Luke, Luke is very much establishing the tie of Jesus from old to new. So the infancy narrative is important because it establishes who he is more than the others do. So it's about what was the writer of that particular gospel wanting to achieve.
Mm.
So Matthew is a lot about community and the Christian community. Luke is a bit more about establishing the ties between David and Jesus and those kinds of things.
So I always find it interesting to do this thought experiment. If a group of powerful bishops today met in a certain area and decided on a slightly new canon, but decided on what were going to be our canonical books, would everybody agree, like just see them as the scripture that we all follow from then on? Yeah, well then why do we do that with Nicaea? Because that's exactly what happened. And they had very good arguments. I mean, it's not just they got together and decided on their favourite books and put them all in and said this is canon, bada bing, bada bang. It does help when they're all put in one place and that place is surrounded by Roman guards, and they're given, the emperor tells them to agree on something, right? But really, it was a group of bishops that decided what goes into the canon. They had very good reasons for it. But if we wouldn't accept that today, why are we so closed with the canon? We'll go to Brian and then straight to Chris.
Couple of comments on...
That's not on, Brian.
Oh, Vicky must have turned it off.
Very good.
Sorry. My understanding is that at the Reformation, the Apocrypha was seen as being valuable, but not a part of the canon because they went back to the Jewish scholars and they didn't really credit it in their particular aspects of the canon, so it was pushed to the side. What we think now is our own to judge, but there's nothing wrong with reading it and learning it. It's not going to turn you into a heretic.
Isn't it?
No,
Oh, that's
no,
a
it
shame.
isn't. And I think it educates us an awful lot about the history, and that helps us to understand the whole thing. I had another thought, but now I've gone and lost it. So I will come back when I remember.
All right, Chris.
My comment, it's not on.
Is that a push-up or is that the button? That could be the
He's got-
button.
hang on, I'll just turn him up.
Oh, okay, sweet, very good.
Try now.
My comment is that, and it's still not on, but
Yeah,
it's
that's
coming. Okay, is that to take the thought experiment the other way around,
Sure.
if there hadn't been a council
Yep.
that's done that work, even if that work may be seen as flawed in a number of different ways, if there hadn't been, then we would be in quite a confusing mess as more and more different writings were discovered, and people favoured those different writings based on something that they saw in them, or didn't, or that it excluded, or whatever.
Yep.
And as time moves on beyond the actual time of Jesus, it becomes harder and harder for us to replicate and perfect the council.
Yep.
So I don't for any point believe that the council is perfect, but I really thank them for doing that work, and as well as the creed work, etc. And of course, not everyone's going to agree, but how can you get an agreement from everyone on something like that when you've got Gnosticism and Arianism and all those sort of things? We've got to take a position on something.
Yep. No, I completely agree with you, Chris. I'd have nothing to add to that. And I mean, I find it hard getting agreement on changing a hymn and, maybe replacing one of the traditional ones. There'll be so many people that will walk out. I've had people tell me that they don't like the new hymn. So try then putting together a canon. Yeah. I agree. I think it's great we have a canon. I'm not saying that.
Okay, I see a few hands raised, but I see a few hands raised, but I have a comment from Bob Forrester that I shall read out for you.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
He says, growing up, I was able to restrain myself from killing anyone. To suggest that Jesus lacked restraint is questionable. I wonder who the audience was that this was written for.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good. I don't believe you, Bob, but yeah, absolutely.
And comment for him.
I think, what was it? Is it Adam? Made a good point before that. There was a tradition of gods being, showing their power in ways that weren't always good. Sometimes it was quite evil, like killing people, but it showed their power. So maybe it was along those lines and influenced by other things, and I don't know. Yes, Robert.
Is this on? Yes, must be. Mine's more addressed to Brother Nathan. Yeah, that one. I didn't quite hear all what you had to say about the birth narratives and whatever. But I take a little more nuanced view.
I'm going to turn him up.
And I would have thought that to have those birth narratives would be a good reproach to the cult of the Caesars, particularly the time frame. And just that the birth of Jesus was predicted as was, they said, of the Caesars. So I see it as a almost antagonistic to them and say, look, our God is just as good as your God, since they thought the Caesars were God anyway. It's just a little more nuanced view, that's all.
Here we have Benedictine versus Franciscan.
I mean, no doubt that part of sitting behind the writing of the infancy narratives of Jesus will be in line with many other traditions where it's important to tell the story particularly a miraculous story. So a god or gods typically always had some kind of miraculous birth in order to establish them as being a god, because they were different to everybody else. So no doubt sitting behind the infancy narratives in our Bible is that. I think what I was just saying earlier is that if we look at why Luke may write more about the narrative than some of the others, it becomes more important to Luke to tell the story, to establish his, where he's writing, the people he writes to. It's important that he does that.
Yeah, thank you. I may have misheard you before. So.
No worries. Yeah.
Nice. All right, Brian.
Again, this is my understanding, is that the actual finalisation of the canon might have taken place under that, what you're saying, but this was a process that had been going on for lots and lots of years. And like there were books and like we're not talking about the Old Testament part of it, because the New Testament was the one that was defined. And from about, I don't know, the mid 200s, there was general universal agreement about what ones were there. Now, of course, there's always going to be some sense of disagreement, and there were two councils prior to it that affirmed the same one that last one you talk about affirmed. So in history, I don't think it just came down to a few bishops. I think it was actually a process that probably had a fair amount of scrutiny and argy-bargy that went on in order to arrive at these ones. And like if you go and look up the difficult books, the ones that weren't really affirmed that we would read regularly are like James and Hebrews, and Peter, both books of Peter. The end of John, there was a bit of iffiness about Revelation. So they're the ones. It wasn't so much the Gospels that caused concern. They were fairly clear about which ones were acceptable and which ones weren't. So, and like the criteria seems to be around whether they were close to Jesus, an apostle, or closely connected in, and whether they reinforced a fairly high moral view of things like that. And okay, we could call into question and say, well, we do the same thing today. I mean, I myself would say that reading widely helps us to understand. And so there's value in reading the other Bible and hearing that sort of things. Maybe it's just a personal reflection and you can challenge me. But I see that the Gospels that we have in our canon presents Jesus as a caring and compassionate person, not a person who uses his power inappropriately, because in fact he talks about that fairly later on. So I myself can understand, well, that's a fairly good reason not to include this, because that's going to confuse people. But, you reach your own conclusions.
There was no plebiscite into the formation of the canon. So the decision was actually made by a group of bishops. So they would have listened to those few hundreds of years of discussion, yeah. But I stand by the claim, the decision was made by that group of bishops, because we know that plebiscites can make the wrong decision. We've seen that happen. But there was no plebiscite into the canon. So yes, there was definitely discussion, and there were previous councils, but just like we see the filioque clause sneakily into our creed, when the creed was already agreed upon.
Do you think these things have gone away? They're still relevant to us
of course,
today.
that's what
we still discuss the same things, but in a sense, I mean, I've got no problem personally of accepting the canon and allowing that to be the group of books that teach us and interact with this other material on the basis of understanding that. And actually trust that people ahead of me have been genuine, or who arrived in the world before I did, were genuine in their search for the truth as well. And, so that I don't sit here being someone who doesn't have confidence in the scriptures.
Neither do I.
Yeah.
But,
and like Brother Nathan said earlier, I mean, many Christians will put their Bible on the floor. You would not see a Jew or a Muslim ever put their holy scriptures on the floor.
I've seen it.
It would always be above waist level. That's the respect that they give it. Now, I don't think they're worshipping their scriptures. It's just a respectful way, which often, you know, as Christians, we don't apply the same rules to it. But, yeah. Anyway, enough of me.
In very general terms, because I've certainly seen a Muslim do exactly that. All right, Brother Nathan.
Yeah, I guess I sort of agree with what you're sort of saying. I mean, the reality is there wasn't one event in time which led to what is the canon. Many things, even right from the very beginning of the existing documents, who wrote them down for starters, how many of those were written down, that kind of stuff. So when we look at the canon, for example, another of the elements is actually how many of these things are around. And, you know, there was certainly more of this than there were of that, and so some of that played into it. But there certainly was, as Clay is saying, at some point in time, there was a, okay, we now need to say this is our list, acknowledging that lots of things went on, and I'm sure it would have been like some early synods I've been to, where things weren't nice. And there would have been deals in the backgrounds, and there would have been little handshakes and goodness knows what that would have been around. But at some point, they've tried to, as I said, try to delineate what is Christian faith compared to where they had come from, and you know, we just have to take that. And I think the more we learn of other documents, it's important to have those conversations again. You know, even in the translation, you know, the first translation into English is using documents from about the 11th century. So they're not even looking at documents that were, I mean, certainly they might be traced back to stories from them, but they weren't written. Or sorry, no, that's not entirely true. They were scribe documents written that were scribed in the 11th century. So we already have significant time between a story being written down to the extant copy that we have. But even after that, so you know, the first kind of real kind of translation is using those 11th, 12th century documents. But then we have, you know, 40s, 50s, whatever it is, the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. We are, oh, hang on, actually, we know a bit more about bits of Isaiah or bits about this or a bit about that. So, you know, translation committees went back and said we need to retwig. Now, at the end of the day, they weren't massive changes. They weren't suddenly God is Jesus and God are one, the same thing, to now they're not. But there were certainly things that helped us understand, as did more archaeological information about things. So it's really interesting that this comes up, because I'm actually dealing with this in my chapels at school at the moment. We're doing a whole series on what does the Bible say about, and we're talking about what does the Bible say about homosexuality, which is fascinating. Because, you know, when you go back and I talk to the kids and I say, you know, we have to ask questions like, do we, like, for example, say, do you know nobody but Paul used this word? Or very few, maybe 2-3 documents use the word that Paul uses. So we have to bear these things in mind. But I think you touched on also, we need to look at what was the wider message that the councils were trying to give. And it's that overarching message that God is God, Jesus is God's Son. This is the mission of God in the world through Jesus. And I think the choices helped to create the, you know, the moat around the castle, so to speak.
Yep.
Yeah.
I know Robert wanted to say something. Just need a microphone to Robert. Oh, was he? Okay, well, you can go to Adam and then Robert.
Oh, thanks. I was just thinking about, just thinking how the council, for all intents and purposes, made an excellent decision that we can trust in, and we have done for,
Yep.
you know, so many hundreds of years.
Yep.
But I was just thinking about Islam. Like, I don't know a lot about Islam. I don't know a lot about Islam, but I know that they have the Quran, but then they have these hadiths, which are sayings and actions and things attributed to Muhammad. And there's, you know, Iran might, or some of the Sunnis in Iran, some of the Shias in Iran, you know, might believe in some of the hadiths, and then some of the Sunnis in Egypt might believe in other hadiths, and blah, 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 blah. They haven't been, like, sort of canonized or made legitimate, and it causes a lot of real life problems in the world, you know. Yeah, so to actually have something that's, you know, I think most people would say that the Nicaea was influenced by God.
Sure.
Yeah, we can hold on to it and trust it, and we're very fortunate to have this because Islam hasn't got it.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I agree with those positions on the canon. But and you're not doing this. I'm not saying you're doing this at all. But I like to kind of occasionally throw a few spikes at myself. So when I feel a bit comfortable and fluffy and things, it's like, oh, but what about this? What about this? So challenging ourselves is actually useful, because I say we should do it all the time, and that could help us grow and stuff. So challenging, I may say something which actually challenges my position, but I agree with what you guys are saying, 100%. Yeah, the canon's a wonderful thing. However, yes, Robert.
Mine is just an addendum to your comment, Clay.
Yep.
I think if people were to read Kurt Rudolph and Hans Jonas, they're the two world authorities on Gnosticism. And if you read those books, it will clear up a lot of what you're thinking. The only problem is you have to sell your soul to buy them. They're rather expensive. But it does clear up a lot of what you're saying, because he covers that ground in talking about Gnosticism. I'm not sure if you know them, Brother Nathan. Oh, well, they're well-respected
Yeah. Great.
Authors.
Great, thank you. So go and listen to the Jonas Brothers, I think was the comment. Yes, good. Thank you. Brother Nathan, then
So this is just a question, Adam, because I'm not quite sure what you're talking about, the Islam and the other things. Is that similar to the things like the Talmud and the various books of the Jewish rabbi commentaries, where they had the Torah and the Bible, but then they've got copious amounts of people who commented on various aspects. So they were looking at the real life situations of things, and then they had their little things and then written down, you know, various Talmuds and bits and pieces, which are like more than commentaries. They're
Midrash.
That's what I'm looking for. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. So are they the same thing? I think I'm asking.
Yeah, I think there's more. I don't know a lot about Judaism. I don't know a lot about Islam, but I know that the hadiths are, you know, over the centuries, different sects and different, what do they call them, polities, like countries, or, you know, this sultanate or this, have concentrated on the ones that they want to push forward in their society. So a saying might be, you know, a woman is unclean unless she's clothed by a hijab or whatever. And so you'll have 25 imams say, no, Muhammad never said that. And then you'll have 30 other imams saying, yes, he definitely said that. So they're very important for, and apparently they've been debated over for centuries, like the scholars will debate what's legitimate and what's not. But it's, you know, we're trying to sort of, in a way, like link in with God and Christ to be influenced in our understanding and our discernment. But Islam has a human that they're trying to work out what he said. You know, it's very different. So yeah, call me an Islamophobe or whatever. I don't care. But it's they're very important. They're very important. I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of the hadiths are in the Quran, but then there's some that are outside of the Quran.
I've heard you be very respectful, actually, of Islam. So you haven't actually said anything against them. So you're certainly not, you know, as an Islamophobe. And if any Islamic person ends up watching this, please, you know, comment and correct us and build on that. And we've got to remember too, it's interesting that Islam is about 500 years younger than Christianity. And it's interesting to see different movements within Christianity at the same time as where they are in their journey. Yes, Robert.
Again, you have to rely on it being just my understanding, and it's worth going wider than this. But I think that the Quran is established as a canon, and the hadiths are part of the way that they interpret the canon.
So the midrash.
So it's like a midrash. It's like a commentary. It's like a high level understanding because it relates to Muhammad. And again, it would be wrong to think that Islam is just one unit, because like Christianity, there are lots and lots of flavours within, and they will have debates over who is the right line of authority and all of these sorts of things, much as the Christians do. I mean, it doesn't stop them being a united religion, but it's naive to think that they all agree with each other about the right way to go, just as we Christians have struggled with that very same thing. And so in a sense, I myself take that as that God is okay with diversity and us not fully understanding everything, and just journeying with what we understand, where we're at the moment, and being open-minded enough to change if that becomes necessary.
Yeah.
So like Clay says, I would approve of allowing yourself to be challenged in your own understanding. But my hope is that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, I'm not believing this because I can't trust it, because I think there's ample evidence that the folk in the early times did due diligence. And, you know, we can be confident that I think the others would, in other religions, accredit the same thing. And, I mean, if you want to be highly technical, we in Christians allow translations to take place without really thinking about it now, but this wasn't always the case. There's been lots of fighting over getting the language into the language of the people. That was resisted, and people died for trying to do all of this. But if you join the Islamic religion, the idea is the only pure way is to read it in Arabic, which it was written in. So translation it tends to lower its value to some degree. So this is a way of highly regarding your scriptures, but it's the language of Allah, and it's the language that you need to understand to get the full value of it. In Christianity, we don't have to wrestle with that.
Yes, we do. Yep, we do. King James English. That's what Jesus spoke.
Look. There's a portion of people who do believe that the King James is only, but as Brother Nathan said, that was relying on manuscripts that were very much later, and others have gone back further and found things that probably nuance it a little better.
Just as a footnote, any general comments made about Islam and what they believe, how they do it, are extremely generalised and are coming from a place where we're not part of that community. We're not Islamic scholars. So we're very, very happy to be corrected by any of our comments if anybody needs to be. Yeah. Lovely. Go.
Just a general comment on Islam. The Quran was dictated directly from God, they believe. So that's the difference between them and us. That's why they don't change it too much, or can't, because it is the direct words of him, whereas ours are in translation.
Sure. There are certain areas of Christianity and Christians who actually are far more Islamic in their thinking around our scriptures and culturally than what they would ever like to be known as, you know. Yep, and so the scriptures come directly from God. I've heard people say, no, these words were directly spoken to the people who wrote them. You know, it's a very sort of Islamic way of thinking about scripture as well. We get people who, in parts of, you know, and I'm not going to speak of Islam because it's very varied as well. There's a family member of mine who's devoutly Muslim, and a lot of what's been said about Islam in certain areas today is not true of that person, and it's not true of a lot of the Muslims I met in the West Bank. But it can generally be said to be true of certain areas of Islam and things. So, but yeah, I mean, Islam could be culturally. A lot of the really hard line stuff is culturally led more than religiously led by the scriptures a lot of the time. Just like the same in Christianity. There is an Anglican diocese that will kill homosexual people. They'll do it because their government said if you are caught engaging in homosexual acts, you can be executed. And somehow they'll do a million theological backflips and support their government in doing that. And there's still people in our society, in our culture, that will highlight something that's barely spoken about in Scripture. And even when it is, we don't do enough work on the context, and in fact most of the time we want to ignore the context because we've formed our ideas on this, and we'll say this is wrong, therefore you're, you know, not part of God's church. Those are cultural things, cultural more than they are religious or spiritual. We wrap our cultural ideas and our upbringing ideas around our spirituality and have to defend it at all costs. Yep.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, Clay, because one of the things that's, you know, we talked about reading in the original language, which is very much, so their English versions are simply, not quite sure the right word to say, but it doesn't hold the same place. What I do find interesting in all what I was just thinking about as you're speaking, Clay, is that when we look at Christianity, there was a time when it was that way, that the Bible was to be read in its original languages, but also it was only to be read and interpreted by the priestly class. It wasn't until the Reformers came along and the English and various other language translations came in that people had the ability to read it. What I think is missing, and again I'm probably overgeneralising, but I think it's a safe overgeneralisation, is the Christian world has moved from it's being kept in its original languages, read by people who were scholars and who had studied and understood and who were able to interpret and read to, whereas, you know, when was King James, 16 something? No. Anyway, much later. Yeah, something's, but there was the Tyndale translations about 15 something, and I think the earliest is probably 13th century, but at least, so I guess my point is, we have kind of received an English version of the Bible, yet predominantly, and I think I'm safe to say this, predominantly actually don't have any biblical literacy to actually understand and be challenged by. So we passively receive the Bible as given to us by others, and the messages have been perpetuated throughout time rather than necessarily always challenged. So I think as Christians, we have to be ready to hear things and go, oh my God, that doesn't sound right. Why doesn't it sound right? Particularly if the Bible is used as a weapon against another. If it's used to hurt, exclude, or to somehow dehumanize or whatever another individual, we need to be ready to ask, does the Bible actually say that? And we need to become biblically literate. We need to be able to go back and ask the questions that we're kind of asking tonight. And I think by and large, we in Christianity don't do that. We are quite happy to passively receive. I mean, I have conversations every day with students at school who give me the same regurgitation of things, but they've had no critical thought about it. They've just received it as it is. So I think if anything that comes out of tonight would be to encourage people to go back and start doing a bit of study, or at least if you're receiving a message which doesn't feel right, be willing to go back and say, Clay, you need to tell me why it is, so that he can help point you in the direction. But the best is get yourself biblically literate.
Yeah, challenge me. I say it on Sundays quite often. You don't have to agree with everything I say, and if there's any issue, please come and talk to me. I'd love to chat to you about it. Open to challenge. That was a beautiful segue, Brother Nathan, to this is the reason why we have TheoCafes and kind of those sort of things. Bible studies, TheoCafes, all this kind of stuff, because everybody in our pews, from, the 99-year-old lady who, doesn't speak up much, to the 6-year-old little kid who just runs around crazy during the service, everybody can do theology. We should never, ever, ever underestimate people sitting in our pews, no matter where they come from, what part of the society they're from, whether they're in a, worshipping near the university or worshipping out somewhere crazy like Bundaberg or something. Everybody should engage in theology and not be afraid to do so, and not be afraid to be wrong, because I'm wrong all the time. And that's how we grow. So, excellent. Well, I think somebody's come for the 6 p.m. service, which is a shame because we told them that it's not this week. But TheoCafe is closed. Thanks, everybody. Lovely work. Good job.